we are back again for yet another afternoon chat, follow-on discussion regarding the lottery issue. For those listeners that haven't followed the series, I strongly recommend you go on to listen to those on catch-up. Though this episode will be a little bit different. So far, our guest has used the lottery issue to explain why she would have difficulty justifying to God believing in, what I guess, are more mainstream Christian and Islamic views. In this episode, however, we are going to turn the tables and investigate her belief. To our guest and to our listeners, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
So what is it that you believe?
I believe that God exists and that God is a loving, selfless God, and also that Satan exists. And we are experiencing this room, if you will, to choose whether to reject the loving, selfless path or not.
And if one rejects that path, then it is hell, I suppose?
I don't know. It could be that there were beings like us in heaven, and it was suggested by Satan that they were slaves, and given the opportunity, they would choose to reject the loving, selfless path. In which case, it could be that there was heaven if you didn't reject the path, but maybe a never-ending dreamless sleep if you did. But it could be that the room is to allow us to choose which we would rather follow, God or Satan. And John 8 verse 44 could be thought to support the idea of people having chosen to follow Satan. If the room was about which one we would rather follow, then I would expect there to be a symmetry in the situation, and for there to be a hell as well as a heaven. But a symmetry would be maintained even if there was a never-ending dreamless sleep for those that didn't follow either the loving selfless path or the hateful selfish one. A death mat, so to speak.
Are you suggesting there is a death mat?
I don't know, but I wouldn't be surprised. But if there were listeners of yours that were thinking that they would be happy to just aim for the death mat, then that would be a risky gamble. Because supposing there isn't one. Supposing it is either heaven or hell, and they were judged to have rejected the loving, selfless path by choosing a middle way.
From our conversation about Christianity, would I be right in saying that it doesn't matter to you whether Jesus performed the miracles or not?
If Jesus existed, then I would expect Jesus to have performed the sign of Jonah, and for it to be a miracle.
But is it core to your belief that Jesus did exist?
No. What is core to my belief is that a loving, selfless God exists. From what I have read of the accounts, it seems to me that Jesus pointed to the existence of a loving, selfless God and to the following of the loving, selfless path. And I assume that if he existed, there was the miracle of the sign of Jonah, indicating that what he had preached was true.
I see. Now our talk started off with you explaining what you called the lottery issue. Why wouldn't that also be an issue for your belief?
Because with my belief, people from a variety of religions and even atheists could get to heaven. What would matter is whether they rejected the loving, selfless path or not.
What about Jesus stating that people had to believe in Jesus to get to heaven?
I'm not sure where he is reported as saying that. If you mean John 14 verses 6 to 7, then I think it is open to interpretation. Just taking verse 6 where Jesus is reported saying, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." I think it can be interpreted as Jesus representing the loving, selfless path. That path being the way, the truth, and the life, and that no one makes it to heaven other than via that path. In the following verse, he is reported as saying, "If you had known me, then you would have known my Father also." And that makes sense with the loving, selfless path interpretation. The idea being that Jesus was the embodiment of the loving, selfless path, so to speak, and that by knowing that you would have also known God, because they share the same attitude or spirit. I realize some might say, but you missed out the final part where it states, "From now on you know him and have seen him." Again, though I think it is open to interpretation, it could simply be Jesus reiterating the point that by knowing his spirit, they would know God's spirit, and furthermore they were witnesses to that spirit. But the alternative account that I mentioned in our discussion on Christianity allows for the possibility that the last part was just added on by Constantine's men to support the idea that Jesus was God. It could be argued that the interpretation that it is following the path that is important is found in the books of Matthew, Mark, and Luke if one were to consider Jesus a son of man, where it suggests that people could be forgiven for speaking against Jesus but not for blaspheming against the Holy Spirit, which could be interpreted as meaning that it could be forgiven for people thinking that Jesus was off the path, as presumably the people who thought he was a false prophet did. But they wouldn't be forgiven for not being on the path themselves. By the way, I think the blasphemy would only occur if at the end of the life they were off the path. As though their life were the expression, and they hadn't finished what they were saying until their life in this room was over. Anyway, with that different interpretation, there is no suggestion that Jesus was stating that people had to believe Jesus to get to heaven.
In our discussion on Christianity, didn't you suggest that when saying the Son of Man is Lord over the Sabbath, that Jesus was referring to the priests? Yet here, you have chosen to interpret it as though it is referencing Jesus. Are you not contradicting yourself?
I was of the mind that the Son of Man expression referred to humans. Whether they would also be referred to as sons of God or sons of Satan would depend on which they followed. Since in the alternative account Jesus would also be a son of man, the Son of Man expression used in Matthew 12 verse 32 and Luke 12 verse 10 can reference Jesus. I realize other understandings would claim that Jesus was the one male that wasn't the son of any man, as he was born of the Immaculate Conception. But I've already outlined some of my concerns about the Immaculate Conception. Anyway, since we are discussing my belief, it is that I personally don't think it is like some kind of an escape room, where the only way to escape to heaven is to get the right answers regarding many of the details of reality. I think what is required is the embracing of the loving, selfless path. Though, as I said, I wouldn't be surprised that even if people don't, then as long as they also don't embrace the hateful, selfish path, I wouldn't be surprised if they hit the death mat, so to speak.
So given you don't think the lottery issue is an issue for your belief, I presume you think you could justify your belief to God. But could you justify it to an atheist?
I think so, though it's not the same. Justifying my belief about God to God doesn't involve any justification for believing in God. But I'd expect an atheist to be more interested in the justification for believing in God in the first place.
So what is your justification for believing in God?
I would use 2 points. The first being what I shall call the influence issue, the second being the fine-tuning of the experience issue. And these 2 issues need to both be dealt with because they are interlinked, as I will explain later.
Would you mind taking our listeners through each in turn?
Not at all, I am happy to. But before I get into it, I'd just like to lay some groundwork to properly frame the issue. And to help with that, I'd first like to distinguish between what I will be referring to as environmental objects and experiential objects. And to help me do that, I'd like your listeners to imagine a human brain being encased within a robot body, with the robot body being imagined to have a similar relationship to the human brain as the rest of a human body does. In the case of the robot body, they can imagine that the nerve inputs to the brain are simulated and that blood that goes to the brain can be oxygenated, as well as the chemicals being released into the blood being regulated, and also that the robot body would function slightly differently depending on what chemicals were released into the bloodstream.
I'm not sure how useful a science fiction imagining will be, but okay, what's your point?
Would you be happy to assume that the brain could still experience sights, sounds, etc.?
Yes, I was assuming that was the idea. As long as it received the correct nerve signals and so on.
That's handy. But even if some of your listeners wouldn't, they could still just imagine that they were wrong and it would, just to help understand the distinction I'm trying to make. After imagining the human brain experiencing sights and sounds even though it is in a robot body, it is reasonably easy to imagine it experiencing those same sights and sounds if it were kept in some vat-like contraption. As long as it was provided with the same signals and oxygenated blood, etc., as it would have had if it had been in a robot which was wandering around.
Assuming the brain in a vat made all the same choices and thought the same thoughts as the brain in the robot. If that is what you meant, then yes, I think that is fair to say.
That if the brain was to experience watching a butterfly in the robot, it would also experience watching a butterfly while in the vat, if it was given exactly the same signals.
Yes.
Well, in the situation where the robot was watching a butterfly, the butterfly flying around would be an environmental object. The light waves reflected from the butterfly would be detected by the robot eyes, which would send signals to the human brain, giving rise to an experience of the butterfly. The butterfly that was experienced would be an experiential object, and hopefully that becomes clearer for those still struggling with the distinction when we consider the brain in the vat instead of in the robot. The brain could be given the same signals as it would have received had it have been in the robot watching the butterfly, and in both cases there would be an experiential object, which was a butterfly. But in the brain in a vat case, there wouldn't be a corresponding environmental object, which was a butterfly. Because in that case, the light wasn't reflected off a butterfly, which was an environmental object. The signals to the brain were just being generated by the vat's computer. The reason I wanted to make the distinction is because it helps frame the situation. Most non-agnostic atheists would, I assume, think that in the example I just gave, the environmental butterfly would be a physical butterfly, and the experiential butterfly would just be a property of the physical brain. The idea being that reality is a physical reality. I, on the other hand, believe that this universe is simply one room, so to speak, in the mind of God, and perhaps also in the mind of Satan. A room with a particular purpose. That beings like us can choose whether to reject the loving, selfless path or not. So for me, the environmental objects are modeled in the mind of God, and we are given the experience of experiential objects based upon the state of our brains. Our brains and forms being environmental objects modeled in the mind of God.
So you think it is like a virtual reality, but with the objects modeled in the mind of God, rather than on a computer?
Yes, pretty much, but I don't particularly like the term virtual reality, as what it tends to refer to is when there is an embedded model. For example, there could be a model of the butterfly in the computer feeding the signals to the brain in the vat. And I use the term environmental objects to refer to the objects which, in my belief, are modeled in the mind of God, and in many atheist beliefs are physical objects. It is a different view of reality from that held by non-agnostic atheists.
I see. Regardless, I'm not sure how you think that would justify your belief to an atheist. They might simply laugh at your suggestion and hold to their own belief.
They might. And if that was all there was to it, then I wouldn't have considered myself to have justified my belief. All I would have done would have been to point out an alternative to the belief that the environmental objects are physical. I wouldn't have justified believing in that alternative. But even at this point, presumably at least some of those believing that the environmental objects were physical would realize that there had never been any evidence that they were, no evidence that there was a physical at all, none.
You presumably accept that they could say the same to you. That there is no evidence that God exists at all. You believe one thing, they believe another.
They could, but I think an evaluation of the evidence we have, given the issues that I am going to bring up, would make it reasonable to adopt the idea that God does exist as a working assumption, given the issues there are for the story that the universe is a physical one, in which the entities that exist are limited to those modeled in physics. But I think that will be clearer once we have evaluated the issues.
Well then, please enlighten us as to the evidence.
I'll try my best. The first issue is, as I've said, the influence issue. As I understand it, the belief of many of the non-agnostic atheists is that when they die, they will cease to experience. Not some experience of endless blackness, no experience at all. Can you understand that concept after death, no experience at all?
Yes, of course.
If you can tell from your experience that you aren't having no experience at all, that it isn't how they imagine death to be like, then your experience has influenced you, because you are able to tell from your experience.
But can't they agree that you are influenced by your experience?
Few, I think, would deny that they can tell that it isn't what many atheists imagine death to be like. But the issue will be how, in their account, does what is experienced make a difference to the human's behavior. With my belief, for example, it would be imagined that God read how you are willing yourself to respond to your experience, and if the rules permit, make the required adjustments to the brain activity.
But how would that work? Wouldn't God's changes to the brain state be noticed by scientists?
Result in brain activity they couldn't explain, you mean?
Yes.
I don't see the need for any brain activity which the scientists couldn't claim they could explain. Only the need for brain activity which they couldn't reliably predict. As I understand it, the human brain contains billions of neurons, with a neuron being potentially connected to thousands of other neurons, receiving signals from some, sending signals to others, maybe even receiving signals from some of the same neurons it's sending signals to. Anyway, as I understand it, whether a neuron passes a signal on depends heavily on the amount of signal it is receiving. That is way oversimplified, but I don't think it matters. In many cases, the amount of neurons a neuron was receiving signals from, and the frequency of those signals would allow for a reliable prediction regarding whether the neuron receiving those signals was going to fire or not. And if God made a change to one of those cases, then potentially it could be spotted by scientists. But I wouldn't expect God to be making the changes to those cases. I would expect God to be making the changes to the borderline cases, which weren't so reliably predictable. Because it seems to me entirely possible that God could, for example, utilize these borderline cases to ensure the outcome reflects the choice, by knowing which borderline cases would need to be changed to give the desired effect. I assume any scientists monitoring it would be happy to claim that they could explain it, as I assume their prediction for the borderline cases would be based on a percentage. Due to their inability to monitor where the individual ions or molecules in the brain fluids that the firings depended on were. That instead they would just measure whether the firings were within the acceptable bounds of what they expected to observe, and if they were, then consider them explainable by their theory.
So it could go undetected?
Yes, again, as I understand it, the physicists accept that for them, there is and will always be a degree of unpredictability regarding the activity at the lower levels of what they attempt to model. And I think chaos theory highlights how small changes can lead to big differences in systems that are sensitive to those changes.
Okay, but how is you being able to explain how your experience could influence you if environmental objects were indeed in the mind of God, an argument for God? Are you claiming that the influence cannot be explained if the environmental objects were instead physical?
I'm just pointing out the problem. I'm not trying to make an argument that there is no possible story in which reality is a physical one, because you could, for example, have a story in which something physical was playing the role of God. Something that knew which borderline cases to change to give a reaction to the experience, and had the means to make those changes, for example. But if it is okay with you, I'd like to put such stories to the side for the time being, as I'm not aware of any proponents of a physical reality suggesting such a thing. Is that okay?
That's perfectly fine. But I would like to hear you deal with more mainstream beliefs.
Okay, then let's deal with the idea that reality is a physical one, and that we are some type of biological machine put together by evolution.
Okay.
To help with that, let's consider a non-biological robot, one that is controlled by an internal computer acting as its control module. And let's imagine that it was capable of pretending to be a human on the phone, for example. That people could chat away to it for hours and never realize that they were talking to a robot. And that when it wasn't pretending to be a human, it claimed that it was experiencing, and that it could tell from its experience that at least part of reality was experiencing. Some atheists might think it was experiencing, others might not.
But how do we know anyone else is experiencing? We just have to go from the behavior. If the robot behaves as though it is conscious, and when conversing with it on the phone, you thought you were conversing with a conscious being, then what justification is there for changing your mind about it once you find out it is a robot?
You're right. I don't know any other human forms are being experienced, but I don't doubt that they are, because they have the same form as my human. And it seems reasonable to me to think that, like me, they are able to tell from the experience that part of reality is experiencing. Whereas with a computer, there is no way to compute whether part of reality is experiencing.
That seems like a bold assertion. Care to justify it?
I can try. And to help me, I'll introduce another concept which some of your listeners might not be familiar with, and that is logic gates. An example would be an AND gate. It takes two inputs, which can be thought of as either a 1 or a 0, and gives one output. If the first and second input are both 1, then the output will be 1, else it will be 0.
What do you mean can be thought of as either a 1 or a 0? Are they or not?
Well, they're binary, which means they can be in two different states. And you can think of those two states as a 1 or a 0. Or you could think of those two states as true or false, for example. And maybe they would be used more like that in philosophy. But in computers, though, the inputs and outputs are often electrical signals, which are usually either on or off. Often those signals are thought of as a 1 when the signal is on, and a 0 when the signal is off. Though what the signals are thought of is arbitrary. Now, as I was saying, an AND gate takes two inputs and gives one output. If the inputs are both 1, then the output will be 1, else it will be 0. Another example is a NOT gate. That takes one input and gives the opposite to the input as an output. So if the input is 1, then the output will be 0, but if the input is 0, then the output will be 1. And finally, and this is the one that I really want to talk about, and that is the NAND gate. Putting two inputs into a NAND gate gives the same result as you would get if you put those same two inputs into an AND gate and then put the output into a NOT gate, where with an AND, if both the inputs are 1, the output will be 1, else it will be 0. With a NAND gate, if both the inputs are 1, the output will be a 0, else it will be a 1. The reason I brought NAND gates up is that they are what is known as functionally complete. What that means is that any computation that can in theory be done can be done with NAND gates. And the reason that is important is to help remove the temptation for some people to simply claim that in the future, the software and the computer architecture could be completely different from how it is today, and that maybe a level of complexity will be reached where those computers would consciously experience. The reason it helps is because it enables us simplify what appears to be a complex situation, because we can realize that no matter how complex the computation was in the future, it could simply be done by an arrangement of NAND gates. Another useful thing it highlights is how in a computation, the input and output signals don't have any meaning. All the computation does is produce a set of output signals given the input signals. Though the output signals produced can vary depending on the state of the machine or arrangement of NAND gates in our example.
If the arrangement of NAND gates doesn't change, then given the same inputs, wouldn't the outputs always be the same? If all the NAND gates do is put out a 0 if both inputs are 1, else put out a 1?
No, because they can be arranged in such a way that they can effectively store values, and as such they can have what is referred to as computer memory, and what is stored in the memory can alter how the processing progresses, such that the same inputs can be processed differently depending on what the memory state was like.
That can be done with NAND gates?
Yes.
I see. Please continue.
Well, getting back to justifying the claim that there is no way to compute whether part of reality is experiencing or not. To claim there could be a way of computing it would be tantamount to claiming that whether part of reality experienced or not would make a difference to the way NAND gates could be arranged. Because if whatever the arrangement wasn't only logically possible in one of the situations, then being able to arrange them that way wouldn't indicate which situation it was. And the same computation could ostensibly be performed in either situation.
Are you then arguing that we cannot be some organic computing machine put together by evolution, because there is no way to compute whether part of reality experiences or not? And yet we can tell that part of reality experiences.
That is an argument, but not one of the two that I am using today. I did bring up NAND gates while justifying the point that whether reality experiences or not couldn't be computed. But I was going to bring them up anyway to highlight the issue of the experience influencing the behavior. How would experiencing be said to influence the NAND gate-controlled robot's behavior? The way the behavior was controlled by the NAND gate arrangement would simply be the logical consequence of the arrangement of NAND gates, their state, and the inputs.
But atheists aren't forced to claim that robots are experiencing. Can they not claim that neuroscience might not have the answers to your questions yet? But give it another 100 years, and they are confident that it will have, and that it will be an account compatible with atheism. And maybe it will inform us that such robots would be experiencing, but maybe it will inform us that they wouldn't be.
But just consider the suggestion that such robots would experience. The scientific method entails the idea of using experiments to distinguish between two competing theories. But unless it was claimed that if the robot was experiencing, the NAND gates wouldn't function normally, the behavior of the control unit would just be the logical consequence of the way the NAND gates were arranged, the inputs it received, and the state it was in when it received them, for both the hypothesis that it is experiencing and the hypothesis that it isn't. And because of that, there could be no scientific progress on the issue, because as I mentioned, to make progress, the scientific method relies on being able to perform an experiment to tell which way it was. If both would always expect the same outcome, that the behavior would just be the logical consequence of the way the NAND gates were arranged and the inputs they received, then there would be no experiment to determine which was correct. I realize you just pointed out that the atheists aren't forced to claim that the robot is experiencing, but the reason I brought it up was to highlight that unless they were to claim that there was a difference in the laws of physics between things that were consciously experiencing and things that weren't, then there could be no experiment to establish what, if anything at all, was experienced.
But that could be said about the human brain, could it not? It simply follows the laws of physics, the same as everything else.
Well, if you were to think of the laws of physics as the rules that govern the motion of the environmental entities within the room, then I'm saying that I don't believe the human brain follows the same laws as forms that aren't being consciously experienced. That the brain motions are adjusted under rules that wouldn't apply to forms that aren't being experienced by beings like us. It is just that we are limited in our discovery of those laws. And so the laws in our physics models don't show the difference. But with a NAND gate robot, we could tell that it was simply behaving as we would expect if it wasn't being experienced. Which relates back to your earlier question of how I could justify changing my mind about whether the form that I was talking to on the phone was being consciously experienced. With my belief, if you can reliably predict the behavior, then it isn't being consciously experienced.
I see. So with your belief, it would only be possible to tell whether something wasn't being consciously experienced. But not being able to tell wouldn't necessarily mean it was being experienced, because there would be the possibility that it was simply because it was a case where the complexity was such we were unable to tell it wasn't.
Precisely.
But there, aren't you just assuming that your belief is correct?
I am assuming it is correct. But in this conversation, I am also justifying that assumption, using two issues, the first of which is the influence issue. While I don't know you are experiencing, I know I am, and can therefore tell that at least part of reality is experiencing me. That I can tell that from my experience means that my experience is influencing me, which in turn lets me know that any account which suggests it isn't is wrong. And while that may seem trivially obvious, I'll just give a few examples of where people seem to have overlooked that point. Consider how you were wondering how I could justify not thinking what I was communicating to on the phone was experiencing when I found out it was a robot. But I was able to explain by imagining a robot whose control unit consisted of a computer constructed from NAND gates. Because if one were to imagine it to be experiencing, then how would you also be imagining the experience was influencing the behavior? When the NAND gates would be behaving just as you'd expect them to if you were wrong, and it wasn't experiencing. The reason we assume something is consciously experiencing is because we are thinking that experiencing makes a difference, as we can clearly tell it does for ourselves. With the robot, we can tell it isn't being influenced by being experienced. Another example would be a book by Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow called The Grand Design. In it, they tried to attempt to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything, and jokingly wrote that, unlike the answer given in The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, ours won't simply be 42. For those of you that don't get that cultural reference, there was a series called The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, which was later made into a film, and in it people had asked a computer to answer the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. When they came back to get the answer, 7.5 million years later, it concluded that the answer was 42. There was some irony there because in Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, they had gone to a computer for the answer. But as I've already explained, computers aren't influenced by an experience like ours. And it is our experience that is the evidence of the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. And while Stephen Hawking and Leonard Mlodinow were right that the answer isn't 42, they overlooked the evidence, the experience. They overlooked that the experience was influential, and instead came up with a story which seemed compatible with the idea that things that didn't experience followed the same laws of physics as things that did, and for the same reasons. A problem with such an account would be that if things that did experience followed the same laws of physics as things that didn't, and for the same reasons, then since things that didn't experience wouldn't be following those laws because of any experience, experiencing couldn't be a reason that things that did experience followed the laws, because both things that did and didn't experience would be following the laws for the same reasons. And if what was being experienced didn't influence the way the thing followed the laws of physics, then it wouldn't be influencing the behavior. And as I've already pointed out, that would be implausible. Though strictly speaking, I didn't notice Hawking and Mlodinow address the evidence of our experience at all, and thus there was no entry for consciousness or mind in the index, which allows it to be claimed that their account was compatible with a panpsychic view in which everything is claimed to experience, though I don't see how imagining that they were holding a panpsychic view could help salvage their story. While it would enable it to be claimed that since physics only describes the general structural and mathematical characteristics of the physical, without giving any insight into the nature of what has those characteristics, which opens up the possibility of claiming that the characteristics measured in physics are the result of what it is like to be the physical entity that is being measured, which is a claim that what is being experienced does influence physical behavior. The reason I don't see how that helps is because the real issue for each of us would be, how does the experience each of us has influence the behavior of the form each of us experiences having? Not, how does the experience some fundamental particle or field is having influence our form's behavior? Anyway, Hopefully, I've managed to explain the influence issue and give some hints as to how your listeners could use it to investigate atheist stories regarding the evidence of our experience. And regards to your suggestion earlier that atheists might simply laugh off my suggestion that environmental objects are modeled in the mind of God and hold on to their belief that they are physical. Were you thinking their belief would have addressed the influence issue, or that they simply hadn't faced it?
Okay, well, hopefully our listeners managed to follow your explanation of the influence issue. But that wasn't the only issue you were going to bring up. What about the fine-tuning of the experience issue?
Yes, the fine-tuning of the experience issue. But before I get into it, I think I should start off by explaining what a fine-tuning issue is. It comes up when evaluating different accounts. For example, imagine a case where a burglar is caught trying to rob a safe, and that later, when two detectives examine the CCTV footage, they notice that the burglar entered the 10-digit code required to open the safe correctly on the first attempt. Also, that they came up with two different theories to explain it. One coming up with the theory that the burglar entered a random combination, and it just happened to be the right one. The other coming up with the theory that the burglar knew the combination. When you compare them, the first theory offers no more reason to have expected the right combination to be entered than any of the wrong ones. It just relies on it just happening to be the correct one that was entered, which means there is a fine-tuning issue for that theory. It relies on the combination entered to have been fine-tuned to the correct one, but offers no explanation for why it would have been. The burglar just got lucky. Whereas the second theory, in which the burglar knew the combination, offers an explanation for why the combination should have been fine-tuned to the correct one. The burglar knew the combination. The consideration of fine-tuning is used in science, for example in experiments. Imagine there was a virus, and people developed a vaccine and wanted to test it on some volunteers, and that they split the volunteers into two groups, 1,000 in each group, and they gave the vaccine to the first group and a placebo to the second. A placebo, by the way, is a substance that appears to be the same as the medicine, but which wouldn't be expected to make any medical difference. Supposing 3 months later, within the group that had taken the vaccine, 200 had caught the virus, and 3 had been hospitalized. While in the placebo group, 200 had also caught the virus, but 100 had been hospitalized. One theory could be that the vaccine conferred a high rate of protection from hospitalization due to the virus. The other theory could be that the vaccine didn't offer any protection from the virus. The idea being that both groups had people that got infected but didn't get hospitalized, and it just happened that more of the type of people that wouldn't get hospitalized were in the vaccine group. There is a fine-tuning issue for the idea that the vaccine offered no protection. The explanation has it fine-tuned to there being more people naturally resistant to the virus in the vaccine group, with no explanation for why there would have been. Thus, there is an issue with the fine-tuning suggestion in that theory. It isn't that the theory is incompatible with the results, it is simply that it has a fine-tuning issue. It wouldn't matter whether the experiment were repeated another 1,000 times, and the same results were found each time. The fine-tuning required would be greater, but the problem for the theory is that it offered no reason to have expected that fine-tuning, and therefore the fine-tuning would be an issue for it. And in science, a theory without a fine-tuning issue would tend to be favored over one that has a fine-tuning issue. Thus, in the vaccine example, it would be considered it proven to a certain degree of certainty that the vaccine did offer protection from hospitalization due to the virus. Fine-tuning arguments have also been made for the universe being designed. In chemistry, there is talk of atoms, each atom having a core of protons and neutrons surrounded by electrons. The protons having a charge of +1, electrons having a charge of -1, and the neutrons carry no overall charge. Atoms with different amount of protons form different elements, and the elements are often depicted arranged in the periodic table, the atomic number indicating how many protons each element has. But particle accelerators have allowed protons and neutrons to be broken down even further into up quarks and down quarks. An up quark having a charge of +2/3 and a down quark having a charge of -1/3, a proton being made up of 2 up quarks and 1 down quark, explains why it has a charge of 1. It is just the sum of the charges of the quarks that make it up. The neutron being made up of 1 up quark and 2 down quarks explains why it has a charge of 0. The reason I'm mentioning this is that, as I understand it, It is thought by theoretical physicists that the masses of the electron, the up quark, and the down quark, the three primary particles that make up atoms, needed to be within a small range for there to have been any complex chemistry in the universe. While complex chemistry doesn't guarantee life forms, a lack of it is thought to rule them out. And when I say a small range, what I mean is that if you were to imagine a three-dimensional graph with the mass of an electron on one axis, the mass of an up quark on another, and the mass of a down quark the other, and were then to imagine randomly generating masses within the range of 0 to the mass of a top quark for each of them, with each mass value having an equal chance, then…
Sorry, but would you mind just explaining what a top quark is?
Not at all. The top quark is a type of elementary particle that can be created using large amounts of energy. They have been formed in collisions in the Hadron Collider. They have the largest mass of any known elementary particle. I'm just using its mass to limit how big a mass value we are going to imagine, since we already know an elementary particle can have a mass that large. If we went any higher, then it would be even more unlikely that the randomly selected point would land in a region which allowed for complex chemistry.
Thank you.
No problem. The point is that if you randomly generate the mass of an up quark, a down quark, and an electron, it would give you a point in the graph. And I've been informed that the chance that such a randomly generated point would fall into a value region which would allow for complex chemistry would be less than 1 in 5 trillion. As you can imagine, some theists would argue that this is evidence that the universe is designed to be fit for purpose for minds to experience, having suitable forms through which they can make moral choices and be judged on those choices. That the universe didn't just happen to win the complex chemistry lottery.
Is that your argument? That you can tell from the mass of those particles that the universe is designed to allow us to experience having suitable forms?
No, it's not. Because that argument can be escaped from. The atheists can escape the fine-tuning accusation by claiming that the universe has numerous regions in which the masses of those particles are different. Enough regions that it wouldn't be surprising that at least one of those regions has the masses in the range that would allow complex chemistry. And that it isn't therefore surprising that life forms that could question it would find themselves in a region where the masses of those particles are in a range that results in complex chemistry, as they are the only regions in which such life forms exist.
Would you mind telling us the argument you are using then?
Not at all. I just wanted to introduce your listeners to what a fine-tuning issue is, before I did. The fine-tuning of the experience issue is about our experience. With the idea of the environmental objects being held in the mind of God account, it is explainable why we have the experience that we do. It has to be fit for purpose. It would have been no use if we were associated with an environmental life form in the mind of God, but were ourselves given no experience, or given a flash of light every time a neuron fired or something like that, because those experiences wouldn't be fit for the purpose of choosing whether to reject the loving selfless path or not. Neither would experiencing pain every time the form did something that was beneficial for it, or feeling pleasure every time it did something harmful for it. But with the environmental objects being physical objects, why would you have expected the physical to have experienced at all? Or if an experience were to be imagined in such a universe, why wouldn't it be an experience of being a fundamental entity within that physical universe? Like an electron or electron field or something. If the brain were to be considered, then why not an experience of what it was like to be a brain cell? Or if the whole brain, then why not a flash of light every time a neuron fired? Why on earth would you have expected an experience of what a certain part of the brain state could be thought to represent? Out of all the possible types of experience that could be imagined in a physical universe, why does it just happen to be fine-tuned into an experience type that would be suitable for a spiritual being given a spiritual experience to allow it to make moral choices?
Could there not just be a multitude of universes, each with a different experience type, such that it isn't surprising that at least one with the experience type we are having exists?
But what difference would they be suggesting the experience type made to behavior? Because if none, then we wouldn't have been able to tell what the experience was like. But clearly we can, and clearly the experience influences our behavior.
I see. I'm afraid that is all we have time for today, but I'm sure some of our listeners will have some feedback for you on that. Would you be willing to come back and answer their questions?
I'd be happy to, thank you.
Well, that's all for now. I hope you enjoyed it and will join us again for the next episode of Afternoon Chat.